Now, yesterday we reported on a video which appeared to show the Wagner Group boss Yevgeny Prigozhin for the first time since last month's attempted mutiny in Russia. Well, in that video, Prigozhin addressed his mercenaries in Belarus and he pledged that before deploying them to Africa, these soldiers would help train up the Belarusian army. Well, today it appears that training has got started and Wagner carried out drills alongside Belarusian soldiers in an area close to the Polish border. Well, this has prompted Poland to build up troop numbers along its side of the border. Well, let's get some more analysis now, and we can speak to Velina Tchakarova, who is the founder of the geopolitical consultancy FACE. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's start with last month's mutiny. Knowing what we know now, do you interpret those actions of the mutiny as having been damaging to President Putin, or perhaps a piece of theatrics which actually leaves Putin in a stronger position?
Well, in my view, as I've been actually covering the so-called mutiny right from the beginning, this has been a staged act, and now we actually already see the first steps that point to a kind of coordination, and by no means actually a brokered kind of deal between Prigozhin and Putin. And the reason for that is that not only are now Wagner troops actually training with Belarusian army, claiming to turn this army into the second strongest army, but they will be actually keeping an eye on the nuclear weapons, the Russian nuclear weapons stationed on Belarusian soil, and that they will be also watching the movements along the eastern flank of NATO. So by no means this has been actually a mutiny, a coup or whatsoever, but in fact it allowed actually Putin to not only place Wagner troops, the most loyal as we've seen, and I mean, deriving from the speech of Prigozhin, they have a lot on the agenda, not only in Africa, but more is to be seen, most likely linked again to the military developments in Ukraine. And we should not forget that one of the main goals of Russia before the full-scale war in Ukraine was, in fact, to also have 5 to 8 military bases on African soil. Why? Because they are also seeking an access to the Indo-Pacific for the obvious reason of the big systemic competition between the United States and China there, and Russia obviously wants to have to play a role, to have also an access to this terrain for the future.
Okay, so I mean, it seems like we've learnt a bit more from Wagner's intentions. Just listening to Yevgeny Prigozhin's video message yesterday, what stood out for you? What do you think he was, what announcements, what maneuvers do you think he was lining up for in that address?
Let me first be very, very clear for the audience, and that is that if, or let's say, had Prigozhin truly betrayed Putin, it is highly unlikely that he or his family and relatives would have survived, given Russia's notorious track record in dealing with dissent and traitors.
Okay, let me just interrupt you on that point. I just want to ask your opinion. Do you think that the report that we heard circulating at the time of the mutiny and the subsequent days, that perhaps Prigozhin had some what they call compromat, or some compromising material on President Putin, was simply a red herring, or perhaps someone's wishful thinking?
It is, unfortunately, the Western wishful thinking. Of course, the majority of the Western analysts and obviously intelligence services were delighted to see this kind of developments, pointing to the possibility that finally a political turmoil would happen in the Kremlin. But in reality, I think that this was more or less coordinated for the sake of political stability at home. Why? Because the Russians are more like mostly actually fearful of any kind of civilian wars at home. So any kind of local bloodshed. So in reality, what happened after this so-called mutiny is that the support, the public support, and yes, we can argue, of course, that the polls conducted by the agencies in Russia are more or less not to be trusted. But even Levada poll pointed that more than 70% of Russians would actually vote for Putin following mutiny. So in reality, the first most important reason was domestic oriented, or let's say domestic derived, that Putin has started preparing for the election campaign, and that is the election that will take place on the 17th of March.
Let me just play the devil's advocate here. I mean, you're giving President Putin an awful lot of credit here for having masterminded this wonderful piece of theatre. But isn't it simply possible that he has a loose cannon in the form of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's an unpredictable, unusual sort of a human being, and he's turned into sort of Putin's Frankenstein? That seems to be one of the mainstream lines of thinking in the West. What do you say to that?
Yes, I've heard, of course, about this kind of argumentation, and I fully understand it. But this is very much Western way of thinking. We need to understand that first and foremost, a lot of red lines have been crossed over the last months. That means tolerating Prigozhin's behavior when he was actually bashing publicly the chief of general staff, General Gerasimov, and the Minister of Defense, Shoigu. He never, ever actually has criticized Putin openly until the very last moment on the day of the so-called mutiny. Second, and more important clue that we need to pay attention to is that there are literally no legal and financial consequences for Prigozhin. Now, think of what happened to the oppositional figure Alexei Navalny, who is less influential and less popular. In fact, he's no political threat to Putin whatsoever, and yet he's now, as we speak, facing lifelong prison for much lesser, let's say, actions that he undertook. So no legal consequences, hundreds of millions of US dollars, gold and whatsoever of financial reserves have been returned to Prigozhin. No, as I said, legal consequence. All of the actions of Wagner, I mean, the core of Wagner Group is centered around 5,000 to 6,000 troops, highly motivated, highly professional, former military intelligence, military defense representatives, and so on. These 20 to 25,000 troops that we've been hearing about have been mostly gathered from prisons while Wagner was actually fighting in Ukraine. And as I said, this core of the Wagner Group is continuing its operations, and in fact it has expanded the terrain of its operations, now also being on the ground in Belarus, where, as I said, Russian nuclear weapons have been meanwhile deployed, and the eastern flank, and that means of course Poland specifically, are going to also undertake actions with regard to what is happening in Ukraine.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm so sorry to cut you short. Velina Tchakarova, founder of the geopolitical consultancy FACE, thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much.